The weather above the water that day was gray and bitter, a cold wind running down the Mississippi under a low sky that put no light on the river at all. The man went down into the river inside a barrel he had rebuilt with his own hands, and at the bottom, in water too dark to see through, he learned the thing that would decide everything. The current was moving the riverbed, not the water above it, the bed itself, the sand and the wrecked timber and the sunken cargo he had come down to find, all of it drifting and resettling under his boots while he stood on it. He was salvaging steamboats for a living, walking the floor of the largest river on the continent with the pressure building in his ears, and no instrument in that year could have told him what he was standing on. There was no way to sound the bottom and read it, so a man went down and felt it with his feet. What he felt was that nothing on this river holds still, and that the deadliest problem in bridging it would never be the span up in the air. It would be the footing down under the water. That man was James Buchanan Eads, and he had never built a bridge in his life. He had built diving bells, salvage boats, and Union gunboats, and made a fortune off the bottom of the Mississippi. Now the railroads wanted to cross it at St. Louis, and no one had ever bridged the Mississippi anywhere along its 2,000 miles. The reason was the footing. Eads meant to carry the weight of a steel bridge and a loaded train down through the water, down through as much as 60 and 70 feet of shifting sand, and landed on solid rock more than 100 feet below the surface. Hundreds of tons of iron and stone set within inches of a grade no diver could see, and he meant to do it while the river ran past at several miles an hour, while the steamboats kept their channel open, while the spring floods came down off half a continent, and while every ferry operator in the city hoped he would fail. This is where most people get the bridge wrong. The danger was never the height. It was never the river on top. The thing that killed the men who built it was the solution itself, the very method that made the footing possible. And while they were dying of it, not one person on that site understood why. This is the story of how a self-taught man sent crews to the floor of the Mississippi and kept them alive down there with nothing but pressurized air. It is the story of what that air did to their blood. It is the story of the men who dug the last few feet to bedrock by candlelight and came up bent and could not straighten. And it begins with the question every engineer before Eads had refused to answer, which was how to dig a dry hole at the bottom of a living river. Start with the oldest answer, the one everyone used. Do not fight the river at all. Drive piles into the sand and silt of the bed and find the piers on that, as bridges had been founded for centuries. It is cheap, it is fast, and it is the standard. Eads killed it before anyone could argue for it because he had stood on that bed and felt it travel. If the pier sat on sand, the current would scour the sand from under it. If the sand went, the footing would drop. If the footing dropped, the arch and the train above it would go into the channel. A bridge on the Mississippi bottom was a bridge waiting for the next flood. So try the next answer. Build a cofferdam, a wall of timber and iron driven in a ring around the site. Pump the water out and work in the open air, as harbor crews had for generations in shallow water. In 10 feet of water, it works. At 100 feet, it does not. The weight of that much water pushes in through the floor faster than any pump of the period could clear it, and no crew could de-water against that head. Even then, the work would be dredging blind, unable to prove clean rock had been reached, unable to keep the current from washing silt back over the floor, just graded. So try the last conventional answer, the open caisson, a bottomless box sunk from the top and dug out from inside while the water stays in it. It can go deeper because it never tries to hold the river back, but the digging is still blind, a grab bucket clawing at a bed no one can see, and a single boulder can stop the descent. Worst of all, no man can put his hands and eyes on the bedrock to level it, and Eads would not build on a footing no one had touched. What every one of these failures had in common was the same thing. Water in the hole, get the water out, and a man could stand on the rock itself and work it dry and level and certain, and the only force that could push 100 feet of Mississippi back out of a box and hold it out was air. Air kept at the same pressure the water was pushing with. That was the pneumatic caisson. The idea was old in Europe, but had never been used for a bridge in America. A French mining engineer named Trigger had done it decades before, filling a sealed tube with compressed air to dig a coal shaft through quicksand that would have drowned any open pit, and Eads had seen the principle abroad. Picture an upended drinking glass pushed straight down into a full sink. The air trapped inside keeps the water out, and the deeper it goes, the harder it resists. Hold that air at pressure with a pump instead of by luck. That is the whole machine. A box open at the bottom, sealed at the top, with a low chamber underneath. Pump air in until it balances the river. The water is driven out, and men enter through an airlock to dig on dry ground, while the box sinks under the pier, rising above, and the cruelty is folded inside the elegance. The pressure was not a side effect of the method. It was the method. To hold back 100 feet of river, the air in that chamber had to press with the weight of 100 feet of river, 2 and 3 times the pressure at the surface, hour after hour on every man down there. The same pressure that kept them dry was the pressure forcing the gas of the air into their blood and their tissue, silently, the whole time they worked. The property that made the caisson possible was the property that made it lethal. Eads authorized it as chief engineer over the doubt of older bridgemen, and drove the deepest such work then attempted. What it would cost was still hidden inside the air. The east caisson was a squat iron and timber box the size of a large building, floated into place over the pier line and driven down foot by foot as the masonry pier rose on top of it. It reached bedrock 68 feet below the bed of the river and 103 feet below the surface of the water in February of 1870. The west caisson followed in May, landing 51 feet below the bed and 86 feet below the surface. Those were, at the time, among the deepest bridge foundations ever placed. Go down inside it. At the very bottom sat the working chamber, a low room roofed in iron, only a few feet high, where the men dug, stooped in lamplight. Above it ran a shaft up through the masonry of the growing pier, and at its top sat the airlock, a steel chamber with a door at each end, where the pressure was raised or lowered to pass a man between the ordinary world and the compressed one below. To clear the sand the men undercut, Eads built a sand pump that used the chamber's own pressure to blow the spoil out through a pipe, firing the river bottom up into daylight as a slurry. At the rim of the box ran a cutting edge, an iron shoe that bit into the bed. The men dug the ground from under that edge, and the whole box, pier and all, settled onto the fresh cut, and then an inch, closing on the rock. Everything ran on the air. The air was hot because compressing air heats it, so the chamber stayed thick and humid, lit by open flame that burned hard and strange in the dense atmosphere. Consider what was being held there. 103 feet of the Mississippi River, kept out of an iron room by nothing but pressurized air, while men knelt under it and shaved rock by hand, and the whole system balanced on seals no thicker than they had to be. If the airlock seal failed, the pressure in the chamber would fall. If the pressure fell, the river would come up through the floor of the chamber. If the river came up, the men at the bottom would drown before they could climb the shaft to the lock. The pier had to come down onto rock within inches of true, hundreds of tons landing level on a surface no engineer above the water had ever seen. But the smallest and most fragile thing in that entire 100-foot column was not made of iron or timber or stone. It was a bubble of gas the size of a pinhead in the blood of a man riding the airlock back up to the surface. The seals could hold, the pier could land true, the rock could be sound, and the thing that failed was a single bubble coming out of solution in a man's spine because he had come up too fast. When that failed, he stopped walking. Drafting table covers the work that reached bedrock, and the men whose names the payroll kept only long enough to pay them. Those men are who the rest of this comes down to. They were the laborers St. Louis had in surplus, immigrants and locals, men who needed needed a wage and were not hard to replace, a fact that decided much of what happened to them. The working day was governed entirely by depth. Near the surface, a watch could run for hours. As the box went deeper and the pressure climbed, the watches were cut until at the deepest, the men worked in short spells and spent longer riding the lock than holding a shovel. A man locked in worked bent in the heat and the lamp smoke and locked out. The worst of it came not while they dug, but during the backfilling after bedrock was reached, when crews spent their longest stretches at full pressure packing the chamber solid. That was when men began coming out of the lock bent double, joints screaming, some paralyzed from the waist down. They called the posture the Grecian bend, after a fashion of the day, then shortened it and called the thing itself the bends. Roughly 15 men died of it building this bridge. 2 were left permanently crippled. Dozens more, the records say 77 and 79, and more than 100 taken ill, carried injuries out of that chamber. Eads brought his own physician, Dr. Alphonse Jaminet, down into the compressed air to study it. Jaminet took a severe attack himself and wrote down what it did to him. Eads tried voltaic belts, electric belts strapped to the body, and they did nothing at all. He cut the working hours, and that did something. But the true cause, nitrogen driven into the blood by pressure and let loose too quickly when the pressure dropped, would not be set out in print until Paul Bert published it in Paris in 1878. 4 years after this bridge opened, every one of these men was fighting an enemy no one on earth could yet name. When the men struck for higher pay, Eads waited for them out, because the city was full of others who needed work. And after a few days, the crews went back down. Whether the rate was fair against what the work took out of a body is a question the payroll does not answer, because the payroll was written by the men who set the rate. And that is where these workers finally vanish. They are counted in Jaminet's pages as pressures and cases and watches, and counted in the company's books as wages paid, and past that most of them carry no surname anyone wrote down. We know to the inch how deep the caisson went. We do not know the names of most of the men who took it there. The city did not believe the finished bridge would stand. Railway bridges of that era failed under a single train with terrible regularity, and this one was steel, a material the public did not trust to carry a locomotive over a river. So Eads staged a proof. On the 2nd of July, 1874, he borrowed 14 locomotives from 7 different railroads. Together, they weighed about 550 tons. He had roughly 5 hours of daylight to work with. The engines ran back and forth across the span, singly and coupled, and in every combination, loading the arches far past anything a normal train would do. Thousands packed the levee. More lined the deck above. If a joint slipped, if an arch deflected wrong, the whole thing would go into the river in front of the entire city. It was held. It did not so much as complain. 2 weeks before, a circus man had led a test elephant onto the deck because people believed an elephant would refuse an unsound structure, and the animal walked the whole way to the Illinois shore without pausing. On the 4th of July, President Ulysses Grant dedicated the bridge, and General William Sherman drove a gold spike to finish it. The men who had gone to bedrock were not on the deck for any of it. Some were dead. 2 could not have walked across if they had wanted to. Most had scattered to the next job the moment the piers were done, because there was always a next job, and never a ceremony for the men who dug. Eads himself had gone to France to recover from the strain of it before the work was even over. The pneumatic caisson had, and the ceiling was the human body. You could not send men much deeper than this without killing far more of them. When the Brooklyn Bridge went up 9 years later, its chief engineer, Washington, Roebling stopped his New York caisson short, resting it in packed sand above bedrock rather than march his crews further into the same disease, and the work still left him a broken invalid. Steel piles, drilled shafts, and a proper understanding of how to bring a man up slowly made the airtight chamber unnecessary for most work that followed. What survived was not the box, it was the reckoning that came out of it, the counting Jaminet did, and the dead and crippled on these two rivers became raw material for the science of decompression, the slow and staged return to open air that every deep diver, every tunnel crew, and every astronaut in an airlock now depends on to come home. The men in that chamber were the data nobody meant to gather. Today, you can ride across it. Take the lower deck, and a train carries you over the Mississippi on the oldest bridge on the river, the arches holding you as easily as they once held 14 locomotives. What you cannot see is the part you are actually riding on. The piers beneath your wheels stand on bedrock 100 feet down in the dark, and a man once knelt on that rock in the heat and the lamp smoke and leveled it by hand, with the entire weight of the river held off his back by nothing but pressurized air. And some of the men who knelt there did not come back up the same men who went down. When people picture the moment the railroads finally beat the great rivers, they picture a bridge like this one, and they tend to read it as confidence, as the nerve of the age. The reason it stands is not nerve. It is that one self-taught man refused to set a footing on anything that could move and paid for solid rock in the only currency the river would take. These were the men who carried a bridge down to the floor of the Mississippi and left most of their names in no book at all. And the work they did with their own lungs deserves to be remembered a century and a half later. It was never the river that was the true danger here, and it was never the height. It was the air that kept them alive, and that same air, understood at last on the bed of this river, is what now brings men home from the deep. One note worth flagging: that opening weather line is scene texture rather than a sourced fact, since the cold open is a composite of Eades's salvage diving years rather than one documented day, and the record doesn't pin down the conditions of a specific morning. It reads naturally and does the sensory grounding the open wants, but if you'd rather stay strictly to the record, I can cut it or reword it to sit in a general season instead of that day.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jody Sowell from the Missouri Historical Society, and this is History Spotlight. Completed in 1874, the Eads Bridge was the first bridge across the Mississippi River in St. Louis. Public historian Andrew Wonko tells us why engineers felt that building it was an impossible feat.
In the years immediately following the American Civil War, St. Louis was growing at an unbelievably rapid pace. We were right in the middle of the country, situated on one of the biggest rivers in the continent. But St. Louis had a huge problem. That river that brought all of these goods to and from the city was also becoming this huge barrier as railroads were growing, as the new way things were transported around the country. All the railroads connecting St. Louis to eastern cities had to stop on the Mississippi's banks, and all of those goods had to be ferried across one at a time to get them into St. Louis itself. This was a huge problem that was holding St. Louis back from becoming an even bigger city. St. Louis knew it needed a bridge across the Mississippi River, and the bridge that we got came from one of the most brilliant mechanical minds St. Louis has ever known. James Eads was no stranger to the Mississippi River. When he was 13 years old, he watched all of his family's belongings sink in a steamboat accident right off of the St. Louis levee. After that, he invented a diving bell that allowed him to go down and search for steamboat wrecks on the bottom of the Mississippi. He built ironclad gunboats for the Union Army during the Civil War. His life was tied to the river. But in 1867, he got the commission to build the Mississippi River Bridge at St. Louis. Probably the most fascinating thing about it was that he was a man who had never built anything resembling a bridge any time in his life before, so he certainly knew what kind of stakes he was up against. The Eads Bridge was an engineering marvel like none that had come before. This bridge would leap across the Mississippi River on two piers that spanned 500 feet each. This was shocking and amazing, this length of distance that this bridge was going to be able to cover. But even more amazing was that Eads would use steel to do it. Steel in the 1860s was a metal that was still as much alchemy as science. People did not trust it. They really didn't know what kind of power it had. And when people looked at the plans for the Eads Bridge, this looked skeletal. It looked weak. People thought it was going to fall over just under its own weight. They had no idea what James Eads knew, how strong steel truly was and what kind of incredible weight it could support. The Eads Bridge took from 1867 all the way to 1874 to build, and again was an engineering marvel unlike any other. When it finally did open, people were still very nervous about it, so James Eads knew a good PR stunt when he saw one. He actually walked a trained circus elephant across the bridge because the widespread belief at the time was that an elephant would not set foot on something that it knew was unstable. If that wasn't enough, at the bridge's opening, he parked 14 fully loaded locomotives on the bridge at the same time just to prove how unbelievably strong it truly was. It still stands 150 years later and is still one of the icons of the city of St. Louis.
Historically, St. Louis was described as first in shoes, first in booze, and last in the American League. Next week on History Spotlight, a look at St. Louis's shoe industry.